Kia ora everyone, and well, what a session that we're walking into with everything that's happening around the world in the last 24 hours, and in particular in Europe with Russia invading the Ukraine, and pretty much as we speak, tanks heading across the Ukraine countryside, which probably does change slightly the tenor of our discussion today. Obviously, we want to be cognizant of what's happening there. We do also want to get to the more macro issues, and I'm sure our panel will do that for us, and the impact of what we're seeing on decades-long trends like globalization and so on. Anyway, we have three excellent panelists for this discussion. Firstly, from the University of New South Wales, Professor Gigi Foster, Professor of Economics, who's joining us live from Sydney. Thank you very much, Gigi, for doing that. We have Rodney Jones, Principal Economist and Analyst at Wigram Capital Advisors. And we have the Honourable Tim Groser, former Minister of Trade and Climate Change Issues, but also a long-standing diplomat with quite a lot of experience around the world, including in Europe. Now, we're changing the batting lineup slightly today on what we'd planned. We'll get Gigi to continue to go first. Tim's going to come in second and probably do a bit more specific stuff around Russia and the Ukraine and the impact of that. Although, Gigi, you're most welcome to start with that. And then Rodney is going to look a bit more specifically at the China situation and perhaps some lessons through there. Now, I've talked to all the panelists ahead of time. We're going to do sort of 5 to 7 minutes each. And again, the aim of the exercise is to have a good discussion for about half of our time. So there's a chance to sort of lay out the key arguments, and then we'll come back to them. So Gigi, thank you very much for your time, and over to you.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, and thanks for forging ahead with this conference despite the online and in-person debate that was going on for a while. So I want to use my 5 to 7 minutes to focus on the things that I think are most important for the Antipodes going forward. I will speak a little bit about Russia and Ukraine, but the main thing that I think is important to bear in mind is that the last 2 years have been a catastrophic policy ball drop. They have been very, very bad for the economies and the welfare of both Australia and New Zealand. And so the best thing that we can do going forward for our economies is to exit the COVID madness as quickly and sort of methodically as possible, while reassuring people that this is the right direction to go in, because we have basically paralyzed people with fear and really hurt them in terms of their perspective on COVID and other health problems. And we need to help them to recover some sense and to be able to then activate their consumption and investment behaviors as they need to be activated in order to grow our economies going forward. So the first thing is to drop all of these restrictions about COVID that are limiting business and consumption activity all over the Antipodes, while again reassuring people. And I think that some use of things like on-the-spot testing or other kinds of very easier, I suppose, methods to reassure people are much better than border restrictions and mask mandates or other kinds of mandates that are really distracting from what New Zealand and Australia need to work on going forward. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that as part of our COVID policy response, we have seriously disrupted many of the industries that Australia and New Zealand have relied upon in the past, and that really play to our comparative advantages. Immigration, tourism, education, the arts and entertainment, of course, but all of these things, maybe with the exception of arts and entertainment, rely heavily on borders being open and people being able to freely move about, and capital, of course, as well. And so from my perspective, and I think that the politicians here in Australia do see this, I'm not sure whether that's the case in New Zealand, but I think we have to refocus on making our countries an appealing place to work, study, do business, and live. And so we need to try to get rid of the brand image that we have at the moment of, very scared populace with a lot of control response to anything that's potentially going to be threatening, not very much risk tolerance, and not a very friendly place to be if you happen to get caught here when there is a crisis, because you will not be treated very well. You'll be turfed out, as our temporary migrants and our students were at the height of COVID. So I think we need to repair our brand damage, basically, repair the image of the brand of Australia and New Zealand, and try to encourage as much immigration as possible and tourism and students coming back and all of that. If we don't do that, see, the issue is not that the economy is necessarily going to sink in the short run. In fact, we see here in Australia that the unemployment rate is very low. The GDP doesn't seem to be, taking as much of a knock as people had expected, although that's always in arrears number that we collect and release here. But it just doesn't seem that there's the evidence yet in these kind of standard statistics that we've really hurt ourselves. But in the long run, without immigration, we will grow more slowly, we will become more parochial, and there's a danger of being more xenophobic. And I think other countries in the world, like, for example, Scandinavia, the UK, who are dropping those restrictions, will not suffer those longer run effects. And so over the longer run, Australia and New Zealand risk being left behind. So that, to my mind, is the main danger. Very briefly, the other things that I'm looking at, the labor market is a very interesting phenomenon at the moment. People are reevaluating where they want to be in the labor market. They're changing their hours up. There's obviously been so much disruption that new choices are possible. Sometimes new discoveries of technology have been made, which I think will stick. That's fine, but I don't think we're going to get back to the levels of productivity that we were looking at pre-COVID for another probably couple of years. Natural resources, of course, is a huge issue for the Antipodes, for Australia, particularly in iron ore, for example. For New Zealand, I suppose you have your sheep and a lot of other things. And so I keep an eye on the iron ore price. And of course, that comes down to how much construction is happening overseas, including in China. The debt repayment that, of course, is going to have to happen, which will crowd out other kinds of expenditure. I worry that may also, drag the economy down and human welfare down with it. Now, on Russia and Ukraine, from my perspective, is a bit of a useful distraction at the moment for us to be thinking about something other than COVID. I wish it weren't a war. But I think that maybe it will help some people to recover some sense about what's actually important and speed our exit from the COVID madness. I think I'll leave it there.
Okay. Thank you very much, Gigi. I'm sort of sensing that you think some of the health response has overwhelmed the economic response for COVID. We'll come back to that definitely. Let's go and talk a little bit more specifically then about Russia and the Ukraine and the impacts globally. We have seen dramatic scenes in the last 24 hours, and I'm sure we'll see more in the next 24 hours. Tim Groser is former diplomat and foreign trade minister who is very familiar with that part of the world. Tim, I know I asked you late this morning whether you could change your comments a bit to give us a bit more of that flavour. I hope I didn't catch you too much by surprise.
No, not at all, Stephen, and thank you for inviting me on this panel. I'm going to start with an anecdote which I think has suddenly become very topical because I happened to be in Moscow at the time the Russians started this process of trying to redraw the map of the Ukraine. So I had a long-standing relationship with essentially Russia's chief trade negotiator when I was still WTO ambassador and chairman of the global agriculture negotiations in Geneva. And I wrote a think piece for his boss, Elvira Nabiulina, who was then the Minister of Commerce, and now she's the governor of the Central Bank of Russia. Boy, she's going to have her hands full in the next 2 to 3 months. So I said to them, look, you'll eventually get into the WTO and join that global system, but that's only half the game. Why don't you do what China has done? Take this small APEC economy, New Zealand, and create your first FTA. And to my astonishment, they said yes. So 2 years later, it took a long time to negotiate. I'm up in Moscow. I do a deal with an outstanding Russian intellectual, Ulyukayev, who's now in jail for 8 years on trumped-up corruption charges by President Putin. And I finished the negotiation in Moscow, and I texted the Prime Minister, John Key, and said, do you mind if I miss the cabinet meeting next week because I need to be here for a signing ceremony? He texted me back and said, no problem, congratulations, see you on your return. So I went out partying in Moscow with the ambassador and his team, didn't read the news. And on Monday morning, I turned on my iPad to find that the lead item in the New Zealand main media was Prime Minister orders Trade Minister Groser to return from Moscow immediately. And I'm thinking, well, what the hell has that got to do with his last instruction? What I did not realize was that they had, in the previous 48 hours, started this process of dismantling the Ukraine. And it was obviously, in both the prime ministers, eventually, my view, not going to be a good look if a small Western country and member of the Five Eyes arrangement was seen in Pravda front page, smiling, signing Russia's first ever trade agreement with an APEC economy after they had done this. Now, I think we need to understand that that process of integrating Russia into the global economy via both the WTO, which took them, I think, 12 years to negotiate their way in there, and then eventually into APEC and the agreements that are sort of associated with the APEC framework, is part of the broader picture we're debating today, which is the post-war global era. And we shouldn't forget, for example, that the resignation of the pro-Russian president of Ukraine in 2013, I think, was early 2014, Yanukovych, was actually sparked by his refusal to sign a comprehensive trade agreement with the EU. So I'm not the only analyst that is commenting on these terms. There are sort of essentially three pillars of globalization in the post-war era. One is respect for sovereignty, and in particular, no attempt to redraw the lines of boundaries established after the war because it has trapped ethnically comparable people behind different political configurations. The second was to enforce peace through US-led deterrence and security agreements. And the third was inside each sovereign country was, a movement towards respect of human rights, peaceful transfer of power, democracy largely defined. So all of these things are part of the post-war global era, and they're all under pressure. And my story about the collapse of this FTA is, I think, a sign of the times that we are under. And I'm very concerned about it, Stephen, primarily because I'm a great devotee of Robert Kagan, the so-called neocon, although I don't find that label particularly revealing, whose recent book about 2 years ago, The Jungle Grows Back, the very title suggesting globalization, is slowly under massive pressure. And fundamentally, it all comes down to the United States. All of this was underwritten by the massive relative power of the United States. As Kagan points out in many of his writings, liberal ideas have been around since the Enlightenment for centuries. The only reason they succeeded after the catastrophe of two European-initiated wars in the 20th century was because for the first time they had massive relative power to enforce those liberal principles. And now we see the United States in real trouble. They withdrew from TPP when I was New Zealand ambassador in Washington. I witnessed that disaster of American policy. They are occupying essentially an empty seat approach in the WTO, and I spent 11 years of my life in the WTO and the GATT before that. And I think we're under a lot of pressure, frankly, on the institutional frameworks of globalization. I think it's not about to collapse. I could elaborate on that if you're interested. But I do think we need to recognize that we are living in very uncertain times. And I'd like to finish my introductory comments by referring to a quote that anyone who's ever been a student of globalization will have come across. It's a very famous quote from Keynes's brilliant polemic, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, when he said something like, I don't have the quote in front of me, but an English gentleman, could, prior to the outbreak of World War in 1914, sit in his bed and drink coffee from plantations in Ceylon, order more investments in Argentinian railways, and so on and so on. In other words, the pre-World War I globalization era. And of course, it all came down to a shattering collapse as the consequence of war. Because at the end of the day, Globalization is a political construct. Yes, it's driven by technology and by profit maximization and the search for business opportunities. But it runs through the arteries of certain political understandings, keeping a global trade and payment system open. And they right now, Stephen, are under a lot of pressure.
Okay, thank you very much, Tim. We'll come back and address where they might go with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and what might happen next. And in fact, our next guest may comment on that as well. Rodney Jones is the principal economist and analyst at Wigram Capital Advisors. He has a long history of working in China for a range of clients and has been a China watcher for a long time, but I also understand has much broader knowledge of the geopolitical world as it relates to business and economics. Rodney, thank you for joining us. These are indeed strange times. What's your current take?
Well, I've spent the morning revising, or since 4 a.m. Ukraine time yesterday, revising what I was going to say. Like what Tim Groser said, that Keynes quote, I come at globalization as an economist. And again, look back at that 1870 to 1913 period where you had free movement of capital, labor, and goods. And that all came to a crashing end in World War I. And then, part of the reason the UK went back on the gold standard in the 20s was to try and recreate that world. In a sense, we're in a similar position now. That's what framing we've been thinking in terms of, and the pandemic represented that sort of break. Now it appears even, that seems a bit trite given what's happened in Ukraine in the last 24 hours. And so it kind of reminds you of that Hemingway line that you go bankrupt two ways, slowly, then suddenly, or gradually, then suddenly. And that has been the path of globalization. It's been this slow unwinding, and it was fascinating to hear the story from Tim about Crimea and New Zealand's FTA, because living in China at that time, that 2014-2015 period was a key turning point in terms of the South China Sea, the rise of Xi Jinping, the move away from collective leadership, and that culminated in 2017 with the end of term limits, and Xi now this October, or in all likelihood, are going to have a third term. And so what we've got is now we've got this accelerated downward shift in globalization. I'll come to some of the domestic economic factors that are working in China. But first of all, I think because of what's happened, we need to turn to kind of Russia, China. And I think when the history of this period is written, February 4 will loom as a large date. And I think as a small country like New Zealand, that's a very challenging, what's happened is extremely challenging. And that was a joint statement from between Putin and Xi Jinping, where two things stood out from that. They're friends with no limits, and there's no forbidden areas. Well, within 3 weeks, Putin has tested that new definition of friendship. There was some hope yesterday that Xi had been caught off guard by this and that we would see some commentary from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in China. Unfortunately, when Wang Yi spoke to Lavrov, he kind of affirmed that Russia was acting on legitimate concerns around security. And so this means today, and I've always never done this in public, so this is the first time I've spoken in public on this, is that we do need to now start talking about Taiwan. But in some ways, the joint agreement and then immediately followed by an invasion of Ukraine establishes the cause belli from China's perspective. And so this is, somewhere where, we haven't wanted to go, that we're going to have to start thinking about those dynamics. And that's something new. But for right now, that's still in the future. But it's a new factor in the equation that I've tended to downplay myself. Domestic factors have been really important. There's the factors around the economic policy in China that we associate with kind of diminishing globalization, and that's common prosperity. We've seen the clamp down on the tech and property sectors. I tended to remain quite optimistic until early last year that China could still grow fast, even with this shift towards common prosperity. that's now misplaced. So we've kind of got the market in retreat in China and the state-owned enterprises on the march, and the state with that advancing. So we've got internal dynamics in China that means it turns inwards. And as Gigi kind of referred to, COVID has had this turning inward effect in a lot of countries, including New Zealand, Australia, but particularly in China. And the zero COVID keeps that in play. We now have an opportunity to kind of exit our policies over coming months. In China, as we see in Hong Kong, they're doubling down on zero COVID. And what we're seeing in Hong Kong, just a brief comment there, they've used Sinovac for about half their vaccinations, and it looks like it's completely ineffective on stopping transmission, and maybe less effective than previous studies have suggested. So Hong Kong is looking at very high death rates. Hong Kong University is talking about 7,000. Our modeling suggests 10 to 15 is possible, but certainly Omicron's going to spread and is likely to spread into the mainland. And so we've now heading ahead in China to a year dominated by COVID policies, by zero COVID, which means we have another year of turning inward. So it's a lot to absorb, but that's my initial comments.
Thank you very much, Rodney. Thank you to all our panelists for that initial comment. So we're doing a sort of a bit of a stock take. Listening to the three of you, one thing that's quite apparent is the absence of US leadership in this most recent period in different ways, and particularly around the world order, the WTO, for example, and you'd have to say in the last 24 hours, I mean, completely understandable that they're not rushing to go into Ukraine, but again, a sense of US impotence, and I sit there thinking about that and thinking, well, gosh, Russia's about the 12th largest economy in the world these days. It's smaller than Italy. It's not much bigger than Australia economically, and yet here they are thumbing their noses at the world, and so the question really becomes, I suppose, has the West lost its mojo? And I'm not meaning that in terms of militaristically, but just in terms of economically, in terms of its sense of direction, and where are we going with this over the next little while? Where's global trade going? Are we going to see a reduction in trade, or particularly in services trade, or is the West in a position that it can recover and reassert these what have been global norms ever since World War II? So there you go, Gigi. Just a quiet couple of questions. Your thoughts?
Well, I mean, we certainly have seen in the last 2 years a significant reduction in services even within countries, not even covering between countries. I think that the opportunity exists for countries that see the writing on the wall to actually move proactively to try to reignite and reactivate their comparative advantages in the global economy, which still exist. It's still true that Australia just is going to have a comparative advantage in natural resources. It is going to have a comparative advantage in services within a Western English-speaking environment for people who want that. So, that doesn't go away. The economic realities don't go away. And I did study a bit of politics in school, but I am very much consumately an economist. And so I'm thinking about opportunities from that perspective. And you see this being, taken advantage of already in places where there have been reductions or elimination of restrictions. Florida, Texas, obviously Scandinavia, these places are, they've dropped restrictions, or they, even a long time ago, they've dropped them. And you can see just from the demographic movements in the United States that does lead to more economic prosperity. The Californians are moving to Texas. Why? Because it's better for business and it's better for life there. So if Australia and New Zealand really want to be on the front foot and capture what remains of the goodwill for global trade and movement of goods and services and growth and human welfare, then that's what they should do. That is the opportunity. So use this as a reason, if you need one, politically, because that's been the problem for more than a year now. Is politically, it's been impossible to extract, the story from COVID and focus on something else. But use the Ukraine situation or something with China or whatever as a reason to reject all of this madness on COVID and refocus on what is actually good for New Zealand. And that doesn't just mean limiting numbers of people who die from COVID. So I think that's the opportunity. And I do think that we are going to see a continued long tail of the cold shower effect from the kind of inward turning, as I think Rodney put it. But we can try to push against that, and we should.
And globalization seems to be in retreat currently. But do panel members, and perhaps I'll bring in Tim and Rodney, do you see that as transitory, or are we seeing a fundamental shift now in great power politics, which really New Zealand rides along on the way? We don't get to influence that a lot. We have to sort of cope with whatever happens. How do you read it, Tim?
Well, first of all, going back to the Ukraine, I mean, we're all familiar with the law of unintended consequences. And if any situation merits application of that principle, it is war. So I think, as I thought Helen Clark's comments yesterday were absolutely on the money. The Russians are probing the boundaries of the Western powers, and what will actually happen is extremely difficult to forecast with even slight confidence. I suppose, if pressed, I would say the most likely end game is the installation of a puppet regime in Kiev, but it won't stop there. And the consequences for Putin himself in the long term could be disastrous. We just don't know where this is going to go. Going back to the broader framework, I mean, globalization is, putting aside COVID, my own, I don't want to elaborate on this because this is not my field, but my own view is that we're at the beginning of the next phase in management of COVID, which will involve, in fact, dismantling of all these restrictions. It's just that this needs to unfold over time. It's already started in Denmark and other places like that. It will happen in Australia and New Zealand, we're just 6 months too early on this point. So we'll get back to living with COVID. And then we confront this central problem you've raised, Stephen, which is globalization. I mean, globalization being smashed by COVID, but when that is then just part of the background noise, as it will be in my view, where do we go? Well, the first thing, it goes back to my point about American power. The globalization period since 1945, as I have argued, as a very conventional view, rested on massive relative power. And what we've seen is the rise of an alternative power center, mainly China, that does not accept many of the underlying norms. Well, I thought they did, but the situation has changed dramatically. You mentioned Rodney Wong-Yi. I still remember going up to Beijing to have discussions with Wong-Yi when he was Minister of Cross-Straits Relations to clear the lines for me to begin a negotiation of a comprehensive FTA with Taiwan, using, of course, the Chinese Taipei title. And that went very smoothly. We were able to do it. Trade with Taiwan has gone through the roof as a consequence of it. But that window, that was we took advantage as a small Western country of the high point of globalization. No question about this. Situation since then has gone backwards. Question is it perpetually in retreat? And the answer to that can only be, well, the old phrase, predictions of my death have been greatly exaggerated. Don't fall into the trap of predicting the end of globalization, because there are massive technological and economic forces to hold many of the achievements in place. And if we look into my area of specialization, trade policy, that is absolutely the case. So after the disastrous decision of the United States, Trump, I was sitting on the floor of Congress when he announced it, and it was an astonishing sight to see these US politicians respond to him with complete stunned silence. But Japan, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the other members have kept that show on the road. United Kingdom, which is the 6th largest economy in the world, will end up joining that. Of that, I have zero doubt. Korea will be next in. So with respect to the WTO, that's more problematic and far more important than CPTPP, because it controls roughly 60 to 70% of global commerce. We're now testing the limits of what used to be called the bicycle theory of international trade, which posited that protectionism is a little bit like a bicycle. It either moves forward or it slips backwards. But actually the analogy is wrong, because there are many trick cyclists who can keep this thing wobbling in a stationary position for some time. And that is essentially what is happening in Geneva. It's done nothing in the last 20 years, but it has not gone remarkably backwards, except with respect to the United States withdrawal from the dispute settlement process. So I think we should not be overly dramatic about this. I have no doubt that we've seen the high point, at least in my professional life, of globalization. But it's not going to suddenly all fall away, because there are very powerful technological, economic, and political forces trying to hold on to what it has achieved.
Okay. Rodney, your view?
So Xi Jinping uses this line, the East is rising, the West is in decline. But as Tim says, that underestimates the resilience. So yes, we're past, I quite like that framing, we're past the high point. I mean, rather than saying it's the end of globalization, that can globalization survive China turning inward? And then Russia, but Russia is less important economically than geopolitically. It's China that matters economically. And so can globalization still survive China turning inward? And it's going to be tested. Global imbalances are going to worsen. As the private sector struggles in China, we're seeing exports rise and China's kind of structural imbalances, large surpluses come back. So we've got big tests ahead of us, particularly, what happens to Chinese growth this year and next year, what happens with zero COVID. China's run a good surplus and a services deficit. Now that services deficit has shrunk as they don't travel for education, for holidays. It's impossible to go there to sell your services. So we can get back to somewhere, but for now in 2022 and in 2023, the choices that Xi Jinping makes, what happens in China, is in some ways more important than anywhere else. And so, the long term is always difficult. I prefer to focus on the short term. And what we see right now is that China's turning inwards, turning away from globalization. It's not over. And the question then is, what happens in Ukraine is important. What happens to Russia? And then also what happens with China's zero COVID policy? Does the economic cost, the social cost of that become too high? So I used to say that I was a short-term pessimist on China and a long-term optimist. I'm much less optimistic long-term, but that's conditional on Xi Jinping staying on this track. If we can see a change, then better things can happen.
So Gigi, taking your point about New Zealand and Australia getting back to their competitive advantages, of course what's been going on is that through this period, commodity trade has really kept both countries on their feet, and particularly Australia iron ore, but also to China, right? It's China that's underpinning. In a funny way, I remember as a minister 5 years ago being told we were way too dependent on China and way too dependent on dairy. Well, hello, today we're a lot more dependent on China and a lot more dependent on dairy. So from your perspective geopolitically, and Australia's had many more run-ins with China than we have diplomatically in the last year or two, do you see the bigger risk being the China relationship for Australia, or the risk that China actually gets it wrong as they centralise control more under President Xi? The potential for things to get mucked up must be getting higher.
Sure. So, you're of course very, very right that China is extremely important to Australia economically, and that was also reflected in the other panelists' comments. But I do think that it comes down to whether or not it's actually sustainable for China to cut off one of their best sources of natural resources if they in fact decide as the party, okay, we want to build more here or build more there, right? Iron is required for steel, which is required for construction, right? That's sort of how it goes. And same thing for other kinds of natural resources. So first of all, you wonder about what's the level of production going to be of those downstream products around the world, but particularly in China, which will then require us to, require natural resources from someplace. Australia will continue to have a comparative advantage in supplying this. Now, there is some activity in Africa now that may compete with some of our natural resources, and that's the sort of thing that we should worry about. But then there's other exploration here, rare earth metals and whatnot. So I think it was what Tim was saying about the powerful economic forces, right? There are just very powerful forces in play, which come down to the distribution of resources across countries and the actual economic self-interest of those countries. I am more of the mind that Australia will continue to have those natural resources and will need to find other ways to trade with other countries, including there, but also in services. If we don't have Chinese students, we'll have Indian students. If we don't sell our iron to China, we'll try to sell it someplace else, or we'll build something here. So economics has a way of working out the opportunities and exploiting the opportunities when you allow people to make decisions freely and go where they want to go and trade where they want to trade. So again, that restriction of COVID and the restrictions that are put in place by any centralized regime, really, where the government is saying, here's what you should do, here's what you shouldn't do, including in China, that is a huge drag on discovery of new opportunities that could replace some of the ones that have been damaged during this time, or where we feel there's less certainty about the demand going forward for our products and our services. So I am cautiously optimistic, but I agree very much that there's going to be less of a rosy future in terms of growth. And we've known that since the start of our COVID response. We have significantly damaged the trajectory that we otherwise would have been on in terms of GDP per capita. And that, of course, rests very much on our trade overseas. So we've sort of already damaged ourselves now, and now we're trying to recuperate and looking at a much less rosy future, that's for sure. But there's definitely things Australia can do and should do, and the same with New Zealand right now, that would be in the interest of the countries without doubt. And so politically, I think it's quite easy to put together a package and sell it and, just avoid the more damaging directions that some other countries are going.
Because the world has, I suppose, subsumed economics and a whole range of other things, for good or for bad, over the last 20 years. So, for the last 20, 30 years, the world has been all about trying to make their people more prosperous, to do things collectively as a group, to try and boost trade and increase prosperity. And then in the last 2 years, or 3 years probably, you've got China hitting pretty hard on some of its sectors, sort of irrespective of the economic impact. You've had the COVID, which we've talked about, and that's putting, for lots of people can say it's the right thing to do to put the health response ahead of the economic response, but nevertheless it's been done. And now you have a situation in Russia where there's no doubt that the economic price that Eastern Europe and Russia in particular is going to pay for this incursion into Ukraine is going to be pretty high. You sort of wonder, at what point does the world wake up and say, well, actually, we've got to actually make our people more prosperous, and that has to become front and centre again. Tim, do you think that's the sort of calculus that we've got to start thinking about again?
I don't think I can give you a snappy one-line answer to that. One of the things that's going through my mind is what impact the Russian breaking of all the most fundamental rules of stability in Europe will have on American politicians and their thinking. And it's just possible that this could be a giant wake-up call into Washington, and that in itself could become a positive matter. I just don't know. It's just there are too many uncertainties around this new game, uncertainties around how far is President Xi going to take China in this direction. Listening to Rodney, I just keep on coming back to that wonderful analysis of Professor Nicholas Lardy, I think one of the great analysts of the Chinese economy, Peterson Institute, who points out that the state-owned sector of China is the greatest drag on the Chinese economy. The total factor productivity of the SOEs is appalling compared with the Chinese private sector. So if he continues to move in this direction, taking Nicholas's title of his book, The State Strikes Back, in this direction, it's going to increase his problems and China's problems. And in the long run, the biggest issue China faces is the demographic change in Chinese data. The Chinese population is likely to shrink massively over the next 30 or 40 years. And I always remember a professor of demographics pointing out to an audience that I was a participant in that demographic projections tend to be the most reliable of all long-term projections. So we'll wait and see how that plays out. In the meantime, I do think there's a very intriguing political problem facing Australia, New Zealand, and our other partners in the TPP or CPTPP exercise, and that's the Chinese application. All of these trade agreements are not just agreements about international commerce. They're also statements of geopolitical alignment. And I find it really intriguing to think, how on earth are Australia and New Zealand going to react to this? You see, in the early discussions I had with a man that I know, you, Rodney, will, if you don't know him personally, know of him, Wang Shuwen, who is, excuse my appalling Anglo version of Chinese pronunciation, but he's an old friend of mine, and I've known and worked with him for about 15 years. And he even consulted me along with his team in Washington on what on earth they should do in response to Trump's ludicrous trade war on them. So during the earlier discussions, when I was the administrator of the TPP negotiations, because New Zealand's the country that established the TPP exercise, the discussion with Wang Shuwen and the senior Chinese economic officials was they didn't have a political clearance to join, but it's quite clear to me that the Ministry of Commerce wanted to join. And the really intriguing reason they wanted to join was because they wanted the disciplines on SOEs. They were well aware, as Nicholas Lardius, that the SOEs are the weakest part of the Chinese economy. And they wanted those disciplines to reform the weakest part of their economy because, as they used to say to me, the impetus from WTO reform has now run out. We need further external influence. Now, these people are still there. I don't know how this is going to play out. But politically for the United States, for Australia and New Zealand and our other partners, an interest by China in joining CPTPP is fundamentally a different political challenge to when the United States was involved in it. And I think this is going to be a real political problem.
Okay. Look, we're running out of time as always, and we've always got so much more to talk about. I do want to come back, if we can, to the events of the last 24 hours and the impact of those and how they might play out in the Southern Hemisphere. I mean, we know that it's not as immediate and large as it is for our relationship with China when things happen there. But nevertheless, we're seeing a pretty big tearing of the fabric of geopolitics and globalization at the moment with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. An earlier panel talked about increases in commodity prices and potentially increases in inflation as a result, particularly oil and gas, obviously. What do you think are the sort of short, and are there any longer term impacts of what's happening now with Russia and Ukraine? Perhaps, Rodney, if I come to you first, and then just go quickly around the panel to finish.
Yeah, it adds a layer of disruption on an already disrupted world, as we see with supply chains, movement of goods, the frozen movement of services. So it is a real shock, and it will add to inflation, and particularly for Europe, it's a classic supply shock that will diminish growth. So it's going to take time to work through this, what it means. If there's one glimmer of optimism from this discussion today, it's that maybe Putin has sped up the process. Maybe the invasion doesn't go as well as he hopes. Maybe in the end, there's a backlash within Russia and even within China that this is the wrong track to go down. And so, maybe things can happen faster. And in 5 years, we find ourselves in a better position than we would think today.
So I think basically I agree with the analysis that there's going to be probably an impact on prices overseas, and of course if commodity prices go up, that's good for Australia potentially. It depends on what commodities we're speaking of, but we've been worried about inflation anyway for a while now because of the signals in the US and elsewhere, and so it's really just a question of how long it takes to propagate through the supply chains and come here. And we have had a lot of fiscal stimulus, and I think New Zealand has also had that because of COVID. And so that gives sort of the capacity of prices to actually rise because people have the spending capacity. So I am a bit worried about inflation going forward, which would have other effects on the housing market. But just to see things in perspective, the kinds of effects on dampening effects on global trade that we are seeing or may see because of this incipient and now happening war are really small in comparison to what we've done to ourselves over the last 2 years. Again, just to keep it in perspective, we have kicked a massive own goal, not just here in the Antipodes, but overseas as well, many places. And so to focus now on one particular event, it's sort of like saying, gee, the Canadian truckers, stopped trade over the Ambassador Bridge, and isn't that horrible because it's disrupting supply chains and everything? Well, that's exactly what we did, that what the politicians, the leaders of countries all around the world did for many months, if not years, during the COVID period. So keep perspective on what's happening. And also remember, all politics is local. Australia and New Zealand care about what's going on in their backyard, and our political choices are going to be reflective of what's important to Australia and New Zealand. And, as much as it's sad and dismaying to see this sort of tearing of the geopolitical fabric, as Rodney said, in Russia and Ukraine, it's just not that relevant to the guy on the street in Australia. And so what's relevant to him is, can he keep his job? Can he feed his family? Can he see his children thrive? Can he take a vacation in Bali, etc.? And so the best move for the politicians, again, is while things play out overseas, as they will, and there may be some ups and downs in commodity prices and general willingness to trade with other countries, try to do the best that he or she can in his own patch. And that means, again, lifting restrictions, getting back to normal as quickly as possible. Oh, and by the way, if people want some information about that, this is my new book, a reasonably new book about the COVID period. Just have to give a plug. It's available on Amazon. And it does talk about how there isn't a health economics trade-off. Economics is about health. Economics is about providing an opportunity, a platform for the creation of human longevity and well-being. And the policy response we've seen during COVID has not been good for health.
Congratulations on being the panellist across the 2 days who's been able to get through the most naked plug of their book. Well done indeed. And finally, Tim, last word for you, just very briefly, in terms of the impact on New Zealand of what's playing out at the other end of the world.
Well, the first question would be, what will be the direct trade impact? Sanctions will be imposed, but it's important to remember that our total exports to Russia are a tiny $200 million. That's about 1% of New Zealand total global goods exports. And in any event, it is highly unlikely in the past, when sanctions have been implemented for political reasons, almost always food has been exempted. So I think one can move immediately to say that the front of mind thing of the media will be, well, what will this cost if New Zealand joins in sanctions? As we will join in sanctions, I've no doubt about that. Will be absolutely minimal. You wouldn't even notice it. The bigger impacts economically will be through the subtle impacts on the price of oil. Is now, I think this morning, reached 110 in the futures markets. This will add further to US inflation. This will influence decisions by the Fed as to how quickly they want to move on the federal funds rate, and therefore what the outlook for global inflation will be. So I think this sort of the indirect economic impacts are going to be vastly more important than any immediate trade impacts. But, you'd need to have a separate discussion to try and put numbers around that. But certainly far more important. The bigger issues for New Zealand really will be political, and I think we've covered those issues.
Great. Thank you very much to the three of you. Tim Groser, former Trade Minister, Rodney Jones, Principal Economist at Wigram Capital Advisors, and Gigi Foster, Professor of Economics at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. Thank you all three for joining us today and wrapping up our conference program.